The Disruption, a lively discussion between UVA Darden School of Business professors Yael Grushka-Cocaine and Mike Lennox on cutting-edge technologies and practices that are challenging the status quo.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Yael. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you? It's great to chat with you.
I have a question for you.
Okay, hit me.
Are there certain household chores that you hate to do?
Ooh, good question. Isn't that what my husband is for? I kind of like household chores sometimes because it's a nice way to kind of, chill out and diffuse. But I'm a bit bored of unloading and loading the dishwasher. That definitely can go away. I can outsource that. And I don't like everything to do with like the gardening and the sweeping and all the ice that we have now and the snow. So like the outdoors, taking care of our land is something that I definitely don't love doing.
For me, I end up doing the laundry quite a bit, and I don't mind it. It's a very, you feel very accomplished when you finish it. But like the folding of the laundry, right?
Yes.
Like that is just a pain to have to do. Well, the reason I bring this up, because what I want to talk about today are humanoid robots. And the reason I asked the question, because my youth, I remember growing up and being a fan of the show The Jetsons. Did you have The Jetsons growing up?
Not so much, but I know I've seen it, but I wasn't as invested in it. But yes, I'm aware of it. Yeah.
And what comes to mind is Rosie the robot for The Jetsons, who was their maid basically and did all of those types of tasks there. And so this idea that, we might be able to get Rosie the robots here in the near future, these humanoid robots.
Joe the helper around the house, right? Now we're going to go gender neutral these days.
That's right. It could be Joe. It doesn't need to be Rosie. But the idea that you might have an assistant who's kind of humanoid in form, who does whatever task. It doesn't even have to be household chores, but will help us in many ways there. And why this has been a subject for sci-fi for many decades
years.
here.
Yeah.
It's becoming more real. And I thought, this is one we've got to talk about here, of like try to understand where we are. I would just highlight in the 2025 Consumer Electronics Show we just had, you could argue that robots were center stage here. Everything from bartenders mixing cocktails to like the cleaner tidying up spaces. These have become a big hot ticket item here. And it's interesting to see the companies that are doing this. Companies like Boston Dynamics, NVIDIA, Tesla are all getting into this arena here. So, for today, I thought let's take a deep dive on humanoid robots.
Yeah, and I love those examples that you provided, and I've been hearing a lot about it as well, especially when I have conversations around AI and the kind of revolution or big step change that we're feeling in the world. There's a lot of talk about humanoid robots, and part of me thinks is this the software that is catching up with the hardware. So finally we can get more functionality out of some of these robots because we're so much more sophisticated with the systems inside, like with our cars and our vehicles and what we're seeing there. And part of me is also thinking that from an industrial perspective, this is an economics question. Like the costs have gone down. And so suddenly there's a lot more interest because factories can invest in these robots that functionality has increased. And maybe there's just a new way to think about manufacturing. Is it the personal side of things and the kind of consumer side that you think is where we're seeing action? Or is it the more industrial side in your mind?
Well, I think, the history of industrial robots being used in manufacturing goes back now well over 50 years. In fact, it was in the 1960s that we saw General Motors start to use industrial robots for the first time. And I think they continue to progress and be used. But this idea of humanoid robots, I would argue that this goes back millennia. In fact, the first, we might call robots, but we've also been called automatons over the years, could even go back to the ancient Greeks. So the inventor, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Sisyphus of Alexandria built a statue that could both sit and stand. Now, of course, this wasn't using digital technology and AI, but just using mechanics to do so.
Yeah.
Leonardo da Vinci himself designed a knight that could move its arms, legs, and head and could speak by using a drum roll, like we might see in player pianos.
Of course he did, right.
Of course he did, right, of course. Another example, Banu Musa from Baghdad created a flute player that used to use steam to create the sounds and could be adjusted by the user here. So this idea of creating human-like machines, I mean, this goes back to like the dawn of civilization, and maybe as a fascination that we've just always had, could we replicate? The term robot itself is largely credited to a sci-fi play called Rossum's Universal Robots back in the 1920s. And that started to inspire what we might consider more modern and conceptions of robots. The Westinghouse Corporation had something called Electro at the New York World's Fair in 1930.
A lot of innovations come out of the World's Fair, and quite routinely, yeah.
I thought it was interesting the things that it allowed it to do. It had voice commands. It could speak 700 words via a record player. It could smoke cigarettes. Like, I don't know why.
That's what humans did back then, you know? Why not? Yeah,
that's right. It's going to be a human. It's going to smoke cigarettes, apparently, back in 1939.
Yeah, and I grew up obsessing about RoboCop. It was one of my favorite movies when I was growing up. I could watch that movie on repeat. It was so interesting to think about replacing some of the jobs and the functions around us with robots and give us all a chance at something of a second life.
Well, and of course, all of us grew up in our generation with Star Wars and C-3PO, right?
Of course.
If you go back to the 1970s, Sauder University in Japan came up with what we might consider the first really humanoid robot. It could walk, it could speak Japanese, it could grasp things. There have been these challenges of making them move more human-like. Boston Dynamics had one called Atlas, which could actually start to navigate rough terrain, like hike up, mountains and manipulate objects with their hands.
And more recently, Boston Dynamics were also famous with the dancing robots that they could do really fun, cool dancing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's another one, Engineering Arts in 2021 has one called Amika that looks like a real human face and can have facial expressions and interactions here.
Yep. Yeah.
So, I mean, this fascination of building like a robot that is as close to human has been with us for a long time.
Yeah.
I think your point, though, is spot on. What is changing now is that if you think about these earlier attempts, you're programming the algorithm, right? You're trying to decide, we move our arm left to right. Let's write the code to make it move its arm left or right.
In advance of the interaction, right?
Right. Everything is specified in the code. And driven by the coder, if you will, in a very explicit way. With AI, now we're teaching the robots how to learn. And this has been a game changer, as it has been in our world of ChatGPT and generative AI.
Yeah.
We're seeing advances now in robotics that, dare I say, is a game changer for how these will look and act more human than maybe ones we've seen before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. A few years ago, I took a group of students to Japan and we visited SoftBank and we saw a few peppers. Again, these human-like robots. And there was a lot of hope around the functionality and how Pepper could change individuals' lives. At the time, I think that we were all a little bit skeptical around some of that. We were not that impressed by some of the interactive capability that Pepper displayed. This goes back 6 or 7 years now. Of course, I can imagine, given what we can do, everything comes back to generative AI. So given what we can do now with a lot more computing power, but also smarter models and quicker, we know that we can push that limit. So I'm excited to see the next evolution and generation of some of those robots.
And there's a belief that we might be able to make humanoid robots that are as human-like as we are. I was thinking like the Turing test for whether you could tell if something was an AI, have that for a humanoid robot, which immediately makes me think of some of these great sci-fi examples. So have you ever watched The Westworld?
Yes, I have.
Is that on our horizon? Is there a demand for basically replicas of humans that are maybe hard for us to even tell if they're human or not?
Of course. I mean, there's so many aliens, so there's so many movie examples if we go by movies. But I think it's exciting. It's exciting to think about the kind of places and functionality that we would want robots to kind of take over, and where there might be economic forces driving robots to take over that we maybe don't want them to. So, there's probably a distinction there.
Well, and I think about, we've done a podcast on personal companions with generative AI.
Exactly.
Now you embody that in a humanoid robot. Like what are we talking about for human interactions? Are people going to have their just humanoid friends that they hang out with rather than actual humans? Is that the future we're looking at? And is that, theme of this podcast, is that good or bad disruption that we're talking about here?
And I appreciate that. At the end of the day, our very tech, economic, business-like conversations become almost philosophical. So I think it was in RoboCop. Sorry that I'm bringing up the movie again, but I go there, directly. So the question there around law enforcement and the role of judgment and human aspect to the process and safety and security for the individuals who do the jobs is a really interesting one, right? Like, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Why do we want to bring in robots into those roles? How do they help us? But how do they maybe diminish the role itself and what we think about it in society? I think is really an interesting one.
Yeah, I go back. Another pop culture reference is Steven Spielberg's classic Artificial Intelligence from,
Yes.
I think it was like 2000, really foresaw this type of future. And there was a scene that really stuck with me. And I think it's interesting about human behavior. So there's this very disturbing scene where humans have taken these old humanoid robots and are putting them in a battle, zone where they're fighting one another. And of course, we do this already, right? Like we have at least non-humanoid robots that we have fight one another, and it's shows that we watch and the like. But what made it so disturbing, of course, was these look like humans, right? And you build humanity with them, yet they're not human. And Westworld had the same theme of if given license in a playground world, would we behave really badly with these humanoid robots? And so perhaps it says something about human nature, but this idea that if we do create these, they're going to get abused. They're going to be othered by humans. It may be the opposite way. We're talking about them getting kind of brought into the fold with humanity. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? Like, do we embrace this, or is this again, we're always going to put them off in another classification?
It's great. I mean, it's a great question. It's very philosophical. Growing up in a Star Trek infused house and thinking about data and thinking about others, and I do think that we will embrace it. We're getting there. I think it's like baby steps, but actually maybe not that slow these days between Rumba's in the house and Alexa's in the house. Like, I think the appetite to bring in more and more electronics and robotic type developments to interact with us will only lead down the road of having these robots be more and more human. Maybe not to our point when we talked about companions, not always to substitute the emotional aspect, but to definitely contribute to the functionality around our day to day. We have that with our cars, right? Like they're basically robots driving us around. Maybe not humanoid, but it's not long in Total Recall. Didn't we have taxi drivers that were humanoid robots? I remember those. So.
Oh yeah. Well, I think we're at this point, as we always get to, where we need help. We need some expertise to help us here think through this issue and problem. So I'm really pleased to bring in Professor Frank Lee, who's an assistant professor of management information systems at UBC Sauder School of Business. He's also a digital fellow at Stanford University Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Digital Economy Lab. Frank, really a pleasure to have you with us here. Let me open with a question for you here. Help us separate out the hype from the reality of at least where we are now. How advanced are these humanoid robots, and what can we expect over the next few years? I always have to caution that when Elon Musk talks about this, right? It's like we're going to have these perfectly humanoid robots next year. I don't know about that. So Frank, help us out. Where do we kind of stand on these types of humanoid robots?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Yael, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. I think you're spot on that when Elon Musk talks about something, he's usually over optimistic about that. But I wouldn't say that it is not there. I think it is in somewhat foreseeable future. And I would say that humanoid robot is still at its relatively earlier stage compared with other AI technologies such as ChatGPT. It's not a ChatGPT moment because there are a couple of gaps from where we are right now to where we get to the really powerful and capable humanoid robots, one of the caveats is that we do not have enough data to train these robots. Like, it's very easy to collect language information, the language data from the internet, from the books, but to capture human motions is much harder. But we really need that data to really train the robots. We're still waiting for the image net for humanoid robots. But I know that companies are doing that, some research labs are doing that. I think we're getting there.
So this is part of where all that video footage and being recorded all the time is gonna maybe pay some dividends, if you want to see it that way, because that will be footage to train. Is that how to think about it?
I think that's one of the ways. And usually what people do now is that they go to real factories or households and they put sensors on humans to really capture when they are doing somehow they do that. And if they accumulate enough data, then they can really do that as how we train the large language models and have this foundation model for robots.
Frank, at the end of the day, when you're creating a humanoid robot, it is a mechanical system as well. How much of this is already solved in terms of like just the physicality of a human, the way we move our arms and legs, and just the physics of it? Do we have that, managed, and then it's just a matter of the brain is what we need to solve, or is there still kind of physical attributes as well?
Development of the brains is faster than these engineering problems. One of the caveats is this design. And the second is really the cost, right? Do we have to put sensors everywhere in the robots? Like our humans, right? We can feel about temperature, we can feel objects and basically every part of our body, but not necessarily for humanoid robots, right? We only need a certain part of that to have such sensors to, sensing the environment around it, but it's not necessarily the same as what humans do.
And I guess that goes back to maybe something you raised, Yael, about what's the economic case for a fully humanoid robot? Like, why even do this at all? Is it just maybe it's a facial expression that we need, or it's a particular motion? But do we need a fully humanoid robot? Is there a market case for it?
No, I was going to ask the same thing. Like, I'm curious around, like, when is the shift going to come, and what is it going to cost in order for it to be everywhere, right?
Yeah. So if you think about humanoid robots and other types of robots, I think there are mainly two distinctions. One is the physical design. The humanoid robots, you have a head, you have arms, legs, and torso, and everything. And the second is really the purposes and functionalities. Do we really need robots to be humanoid? Maybe there's a demand somewhere in the market. The society is aging, so elderly care, there might be some demand on that. But it's not necessarily all the tasks, all the jobs have to be performed by humanoid robots. Other types of robots can maybe do these better than human.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think even some of these pop cultural references, like my original Rosie the Robot, she didn't have legs, right? She was like a vacuum cleaner was like her base, at the end of the day. It begs the question again, like, why do we need them to be humanoid rather than like what we've seen in industrial applications where they're like designed specifically for the task they're trying to do rather than have this general purpose piece?
So one of the arguments for the pro-humanoid robots is that the physical world around us is designed for humans to do things better. So that's why we might, if we want the robot to be more generalized, we want the humanoid robots. So not only the task that is been originally designed for, maybe some of the other things that it can do, just because it acts as like us in the world around us.
Yeah, so I'm thinking now, this is inspiring me to think, like we have the kind of improved use of AI. We've talked about this before, generative AI. What does it do? It creates human-like output, right? So it's creating sentences and it's talking and it's kind of, it has some kind of logic that it can exert like we can. So I'm imagining what I'm excited about with the humanoid robots is if we want humans to replace us in, it's almost like the fine motor skill activity. If we wanted to do the things that we are doing, we needed to have the physical capability to do it, which is basically to look like us in many ways, right? Like so some of the gripping, the eye-hand coordination and react in the moment to that. Like if you're built like us and you think like us, maybe you can replace us in doing certain things like that, like with the driving, right?
Frank, giving something I've raised earlier, I'd be curious your thoughts on this idea of, as we build these humanoid robots and they look and act more human, do you believe that we build an affinity for them in a way that is similar to a relationship you might have with an actual human?
Oh, it's getting philosophical. I think it really depends, because us humans are so heterogeneous that some people might want, you build a robot and it looks like a human, you have some emotional attachment towards that. I think there's definitely someone working on that, and might be a demand. The rest of the society might think differently. So it's really hard to make any predictions where things might go. But I think we do see the demand on both sides.
We often talk about, in this podcast, we like to think about good disruption and bad disruption, or no disruption at all. Is there anything that kind of keeps you up at night as you study these humanoid robots and you're kind of monitoring the progress and thinking about the use cases and the maybe macroeconomic implications? Is there anything that is keeping you up at night that you think that we should all be tackling or talking about?
I think so. Go back to Mike's point about should we be embracing this or not. I don't think we have a choice. So these technologies are going to advance anyways. We have to embrace it, but it's really about how we want to embrace that. If we think about jobs, the jobs is a bundle of tasks that we perform, and those tasks will not all be automated by robots. Only part of that is going to be automated by robots. So the question to ask is, what tasks to be automated? Are those tasks that we want them to be automated? So the things that we want to do is still left for humans. And will there be new tasks generated? Will there be new jobs generated for humans to do with the advancement of these technologies?
Yeah, and that's been a big question we've tackled a number of times here, is the role of technology in job displacement and whether or not we create those alternative jobs in the wake of them. I'd be curious, what's your familiarity and thoughts on Tesla Optimus? This is getting a lot of press. It's obviously designed to look like a human. They say they're going to mass produce these beginning next year, try to reach 100,000 out there in 2026. I'm curious, both from a technology standpoint, but also from a business standpoint. Like, is there a market out there for these at this point? I don't know if we know the exact price of them at this point, but I imagine they're going to be pretty expensive.
Yeah.
I think that's very impressive for sure. And in terms of market demand, and so I think we might know later today. The earnings call for Tesla, so Elon Musk might say something about it.
Like we said, I take those with a grain of salt because there's a lot of things that are proposed. I will note there was a Goldman Sachs analysis that suggests this could reach $38 billion industry within the next decade, which is, that's obviously substantial. But a good sized industry, they feel.
So where is that coming from in your mind? Where is that growth? Is it industrial growth?
Well, industrial is already there, right? And as we push on these technologies and we increasingly automate, I think we've talked before about things like dark factories, where if you're using only robotics, you don't need any more humans. And so therefore, you can turn the lights off, you can turn the AC off and just let it run. So I think that's been a trend we've been on for 50 plus years here. The humanoid robots, though, like, again, what are the jobs that they're going to do and why do they need to be human-like? I think that's the big question in my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think industrial robots is definitely one of the bigger chunks, at least as of now, and it's been pretty extensively studied in the past decades or so. The opportunity is still in the service robot. It's been less adopted and less studied. And industrial robots is mainly about cost reduction. Right? You replace human with robots, so you don't pay salaries, you pay electricity. I think that might be part of where the value is being created, but still, I think service robots is where more value will be created in the next decade or so.
Yeah, and maybe that's where all of this excitement and startup activity is focused on. And I can imagine, we talk, at least here locally in the United States, there's shortage in nurses and the healthcare care providers. There's shortage in educators and teachers. I can imagine the benefits of being humanoid in that context when you are actually interacting with other humans. And so the service is provided to humans. And so that maybe not only psychologically, but also physically, it makes sense to have something a little bit more human-like in nature.
Frank, this is the point where we say thank you. This has been incredibly helpful to advance our thinking. And I think it's time for Yael and I to decide good, bad, or no disruption. So Yael, what's your thoughts? Where are you at so far?
So you're going to correct me if I'm wrong around the definition of disruption. I think my sense is even the history that you described to us is so long that I feel it's a gradual development and evolution. I don't find it as big of a shock as a disruption. Like, I don't think that within a day we're going to wake up and there's going to be a real change in a certain sector or in a certain segments of jobs or the economy. I think we will, of course, continue to see it grow in functionality and creativity, but it was actually comforting to hear you describe some of the longevity of this and that we've been toying with these ideas and thinking about how to develop these humanoid robots for a long, long time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, I think we have to think it by industry sector and by application. And I think in that sense, there's many times it can be and has been disruptive, right? Just fundamentally changing the way we do things. And I think that will continue. And I like Frank's point about the next frontier might be service work and how we think about humanoid robots in the service of humans, whether it's healthcare or even education or things like that.
Yeah.
I think when I think about the good, so I'm agreeing, and I do think it's a long disruption. When it comes to the good and bad, the reasons that we have tried to build machines that copy humans here, this is maybe just something innate about us of wanting to try to replicate us in a mechanized form. So I think there will be a continual push to create an ultimate humanoid robot that really looks and acts like a human, maybe whether you want to pick Westworld or one of the other sci-fi.
White blood. Yeah. White blood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And whether there's a business case for it, I'm not sure, but I think there'll be just an innate human desire to do this. And that's where I come down on the good and bad, right? Like, is this a good idea? Like, are we playing God, right? Is this Mary Shelley and Frankenstein here? And that we're starting to play with things that maybe we shouldn't.
On the flip side, we can see it as protecting ourselves, right? Like, we want to protect ourselves and we value human life more than ever, that we're investing in alternatives, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I again, I can think of both the good and the bad, and maybe that's true of any technology, as we've often discussed here. But what are the societal and human implications of having very, very human robots amongst us, especially, like I said, if it could get to the point where maybe it's even hard for us to distinguish between one or the other. That's where I start to get into my dystopia mode and think maybe this is not like we're playing with fire.
Well, we're there with a lot of aspects of reading and writing and speaking and creative with the Gen AI. So I think it's just a matter of time. And maybe by then we'll be well trained in how to think about it because of what we're coping with today on those frontiers.
Is this a different conversation than Gen AI and the kind of same fundamental issues? Or is the humanoid representation of it really not really qualitatively different?
I think it's very similar in many ways. I think it's very, very similar. In my mind, that's how I like the questions that it's raising are very similar. I wanted to go back before you make the call, before you declare good or bad disruption. The point about the longevity and the pace of it, my proposal or my question was not so much, is this a disruption, just a very slow and long, elongated disruption, but is it a disruption at all? Like, at some point, when does it not be considered a disruption if it takes so long for it to really make a difference?
I guess using my narrow definition, it would be when it changes the nature of competition in markets. Where it leads to the potential for, an upheaval where new entrants come in and others exit. I'm just taking my narrow definition that we've used in the past. And again, I think there will be disruptions, but they'll be very specific.
Myopic, right? Yeah.
I don't know, maybe baristas and coffee houses will be completely, automated in ways that we don't have now with Starbucks.
Not based on the coffee maker in the lounge, I'll tell you that. I'm debating between good and no disruption. That's what I'm debating, yes.
All right, what should it be? You got to choose.
I got to choose. Okay, I'm going to choose good disruption.
Yes. Always a technology optimist.
I know.
Yeah. I like I said, I worry about these kind of dystopian futures. At the same time, I do think there's any number of use cases where a humanoid-like robot has value and value to society, not just economic value. And for that reason, I'm going to go with good disruption with a little asterisk that says, but let's pay attention to this as it evolves here.
Great.
I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're at a point where this is going to be, really bad for society. But as we get further along, we might want to do this in another, decade again and revisit.
Fair enough.
Thank you to Frank for visiting us today. Thank you to Gary, our producer. Thank you to Becky, our researcher extraordinaire. This is Good Disruption.
Good Disruption is a podcast from the University of Virginia Darden School of Business.